Hello, thank you for tuning in to this lecture titled The History of Religion in China. Today we'll be talking about Taoism and Confucianism, the two main endemic religions of China, as well as ancient divination and contemporary Chinese folk religion. I'm Professor Sydney Morrow, and this video will be comprised of 15-minute segments. Let's get started. We'll begin with oracle bone divination. Hi there. You can see here two examples of oracle bone inscriptions. On the left is the underside of a tortoiseshell, and on the right, the scapula, the shoulder blade of oxen. Inscribed on these bones are Chinese characters, some of the oldest Chinese characters that archaeologists have found, and interestingly, some of the first instances of complete sentences, complete thoughts in Chinese. These bones provide a record, a written record of communications via a diviner, via a medium, with powerful ancestors and appeals to various deities in the ancient Chinese pantheon. The belief was that if humans could understand the order and the patterns of the world, they could behave in such a way to bring about the best set of circumstances and avoid disorder. It was thought that there is an underlying pattern to the way the world is put together, to the way it moves, as in the past extends into the present, and the present into the future. And as humans, we are oriented directly into the present. So the oracle bones are appeals to the gods to lay things out, to make things clear and transparent, what exactly is transpiring right now, so that one understands how things are moving right now will give way to the present. And this will be a consistent theme of Chinese religion. If that didn't make any sense the first time around, I'll keep going back to it. There are two main features that we find in the oracle bone inscriptions. The first is sort of routine, routine transmissions and communications, understandings between humans and ancestors and powerful deities. Basically, certain ancestors and certain deities were to be sacrificed to, mostly using farm animals, on certain days throughout the lunar year. So on the oracle bones, we find basically records of today was the day that we were to sacrifice to this ancestor, this deity, in order to bring about something like a bountiful harvest, right? A really fruitful year in the harvest. We also find in the oracle bones, if the king, if the ruler, if the emperor was to undertake an expedition to see, the lands in his realm, or to see, the borderlands and see if, they were doing all right, to undertake an expedition to give birth to a child, hopefully a son, of course, to take a new wife, or to begin a military campaign. They would conduct a divination to see which would be the most auspicious day, or if times are inauspicious, how long to wait, things like that. And generally, there would be advice on what sort of sacrifices the king or the king's village should perform in order to bring about the best set of circumstances. Many of the oracle bones mention Shangdi, which translated from Chinese basically means the highest god, right? The uppermost deity in the early Chinese pantheon. Pantheon, of course, meaning all of the gods that were included in this belief system in a hierarchical arrangement, right? So there are the lower sorts of deities, and below them, ancestors, actual people who have died. They would be included in the fringes of the pantheon, all the way up to the very highest god. But interestingly, even though Shangdi is mentioned numerous times in the oracle bones, it's clear that living humans did not have a direct line of communication. They couldn't communicate directly to Shangdi. We find in the oracle bones that it's easiest to appeal to one's own ancestors, right? So we're talking about people in one's own family lineage that have died. Those are the easiest people easiest extra human beings, right? People who are not living, included in the pantheon, to get in touch with. And one could appeal to one's own ancestors, ask them to host, like a party, host higher non ancestral deities, such as river and mountain deities. It was believed that every river and every mountain, in fact, every notable feature of the landscape, had a deity associated with it. Ancestors could communicate with these deities, and then those deities in turn could communicate with Shangdi, and then whatever Shangdi's message could be relayed back down and then through the diviner and then written into the oracle bones. Shangdi was the most powerful god in the pantheon and controlled, among other things, the wind and rain. So basically, controlled the weather. This was especially important in Shang Dynasty, as this is when the majority of the what we now call China, right, Chinese population, the early Chinese peoples, became agrarian, started raising primarily millet, right, a grain. So they were extremely concerned for their livelihood on what the weather would provide for them, and Shangdi is the being that controlled the weather. Here we have some examples from the oracle bones. So what we find is that generally the first inscription is the date and the name of the diviner and the person, usually an important person, the king generally, their name, and then the question, and then the result. And here we have some of the results. So we can imagine what the question was: how will the weather be? Something like that. These two divinings from two separate oracle bones read that this 11th month, D will not order rain. And the second divining, on day 40, D will order winds. And this was the entirety of the divining, right? So we can see the importance of the weather. The main, let's call them goals for the oracle bones, right? The reason that these divinations were performed. One, to understand the motivations of ancestors and deities. And once we know the motivations, what sorts of sacrifices would make the best appeal, right? To for them to be helpful in whatever the king generally hoped to bring about. It is important to note here, and it's a common theme in Chinese religion, that the reason that ancestors and deities, one reason that ancestors and deities have so much power, is that they are so old, right? Of course, ancestors have died. The lives that they experience are in the past, and their experience of the world is broader, right? Is includes more time. It was thought in ancient Chinese cosmology that there's no outside place that the dead go to. There's no heaven, so to speak. That everyone who's ever lived and died is still included in the same cosmos, the same world as the living. So ancestors continue to experience the world, and by virtue of no longer being limited by bodies, by time, they have the power to change the forces that shape the cosmos. And deities, such as the river and mountain deities I mentioned earlier, have been around as long as the land form, right? As long as the river has existed, as long as the mountain has existed. So we find here basically appeals not only to powerful ancestors and deities, but appeals to the past generally for answers. The second goal is, once you know them well, right, to ask them to grant assistance to protect the king on his expedition, to grant him the birth of a son, right, to bring enough rain to cultivate crops, but not too much to flood them out. And in the case of more bellicose, right, more angry gods and deities, to deter them from bringing disaster by making the appropriate sacrifices at the appropriate times. To recap, The oracle bones are linguistic inscriptions on animal bones that question or that chronicle the questions to and answers from ancestral spirits and higher deities. They concerned how and when to make the appropriate sacrifices to the appropriate ancestors and spirits. They illustrate the belief in ancient China that ancestors and deities shape the forces that govern human life, and that there is a natural order that, when preserved, will bring harmony and vitality to the human world. Next, we'll talk about I Ching divination. I Ching is the pinyin, which means the transliteration into Latin letters of these characters that you see here. It is also translated as the classic of changes. The literal Chinese translation, the character on the left, is yi, which means change, and jing, which means book or classic. So basically, it's a collection of all the changes. What you see here is the actual collection of changes. It was believed that these 64 different symbols represented the entirety of the number of cosmic forces, and that if we can figure out which force prevails, which change describes what happens now, then we can figure out what happens next. This is the making of the oracle of the I Ching. All in all, there are 64 types in this chart that you see here. It's the same 64 hexagrams in two different orientations. It's thought that this was what the diviner used to do the divination, to find the appropriate change. The legend goes that ancient sages, one of three ancient sages, it depends on the text which one it was, created the hexagrams to symbolize all the cosmic forces. Hexagram means a symbol comprised of 6 lines. So you see here, there are 6 lines arranged vertically from bottom to top that exhaust every possible change. If you look, for example, at the top left hexagram in the grid in the middle and the bottom right hexagram, you'll see the dual corresponding pair of opposite hexagrams. One is all, as we say, broken lines in the top left, and one is all unbroken lines in the bottom right. It is thought that every change that exists in between these two are subtle gradations of the extreme, as one gradually shifts into the other. It was believed that change is how sages saw the world. Sage would mean something like the person who has the most wisdom, the person who's seen enough to know not only the most minute elements of what's happening now, but how what's happening now gives way to, leads to what will happen in the future. In this way, one could say that the sages could see the future, but only because of their knowledge of what's happening right now. The sage can see these patterns, right? See these changes, and that one change always follows after another, just as winter always follows autumn. It never goes the other way around. A sage sees everything as if the pattern were that clear. It's believed that the changes were collected and ordered in the early 9th century BCE, so the oracle bones gave way to I Ching divination. The hexagrams represented the collected wisdom from the past, all of the lessons learned in the past that we could apply to our current situation now. This type of divination is referred to as geomantic or geomantic divination. In it, the diviner uses natural objects to generate hexagrams, and each hexagram represents a type of change. The diviner would collect, in most cases, the stalks of a certain plant and cast them in a certain way, cast them down, and then interpret how they'd lain in order to come up with a hexagram. We will continue this in the next video.